What is HelloFresh? With HelloFresh, you get farm fresh, pre-portioned ingredients and seasonal recipes delivered right to your doorstep. Skip the trips to the grocery store and count on HelloFresh to make home cooking easy, fun, and affordable. That's why it's America's #1 meal kit. Fall is right around the corner, and HelloFresh is there to help you plan for the busy season ahead with tasty dishes delivered right to your door. You just simply choose recipes and pick your delivery date, then lay back and enjoy the last days of summer, knowing that dinner is covered. Parents have enough back-to-school shopping and planning to do. Let HelloFresh get the groceries and save you some cash with pre-portioned meals, again, delivered right to your door. So when life gets busy, don't call for delivery, go with HelloFresh. I've been using HelloFresh for a while now, and I cannot tell you how much simpler making dinner has become. It really does give me one less thing to worry about. So go to HelloFresh.com/50whokilled and use code 50whokilled for 50% off plus free shipping. Again, go to HelloFresh.com/50whokilled and use code 50whokilled for 50% off plus free shipping. Slow Burn Media and Evergreen Podcast presents Who Killed, a podcast that provides a voice for the voiceless.
As far as we know, the children's Tylenol, the chewable, have not been implicated yet.
Exactly what is going on right now, they're just assuming that it could be the cyanide-laced capsule also.
Waiting control center.
The phone has been ringing off the hook at Rush Presbyterian St. Luke's Medical Center in Chicago. It's the regional poison control center for the entire Chicago area. Poison specialist Lane Olaf.
We've been receiving calls about once every 15 seconds. At Rush Presbyterian St. Luke's, we only have 3 poison lines, and they're lit up constantly, ever since yesterday morning.
Right now, they're telling people which lots of Tylenol are known to have contaminated capsules and checking to see if callers have displayed any symptoms of cyanide poisoning.
If they have that, tell them to go in the emergency room. If they don't have that and they took it yesterday, we just tell them, you're probably going to have no problem with it. Just hold on to the bottles. Don't take any Tylenol extra strength for the time being until you hear otherwise.
Most of what's going on here is informational. Officials here say if anyone has taken a cyanide-laced Tylenol capsule, they probably wouldn't be able to make it to the phone to call.
They used to.
I'm Jeff Locke, CNN, at Rush Presbyterian St. Luke's Medical Center in Chicago.
Hello and welcome to episode 204 of Who Killed. I am your host, Bill Huffman, and this is a Slow Burn Media, Evergreen Podcasts, as well as Killer Podcast production. And this week, I am very, very lucky to be joined by 2 investigative journalists from the Chicago Tribune who just so happen to be the hosts of an extremely popular podcast about one of the most interesting true crime cases probably in the United States of America, and that would be the Chicago Tylenol Murders. And I would like to welcome reporter Stacy St. Clair and Christy Gutowski to Who Killed. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks for having us.
So I have to ask, when you listen to the trailer of your podcast, you talk about this case looming over you for decades, and I just wanted to know a little bit about how that particular case, stuck with you. I mean, it clearly is a huge case nationally, but being there on the ground, how did you guys get involved?
Stacy and I got our start in journalism working for a suburban paper in suburban Chicago, the Daily Herald, and it was in Herald City that many of the victims lived and died. So we were too young to be reporters. In 1982, I was 13 years old, so I remember it and remember the fear it caused at Halloween, but didn't get into out of college and become reporters until the 90s. And one of my, I think it was my first Metro beat was a courts reporter in DuPage County, and many of the investigators from Task Force 2 were at the twilight, the end of their career, and they got basically second jobs as investigators. in the state's attorney's office. So I got to know some of these guys early in my career, and the case just haunted them, stuck with them, that they were never able to solve it. And then Stacy and I, just through our reporting paths, started covering developments, anniversary pieces, things like that. And that's how we got into it professionally.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I know that, like, with the anniversaries and stuff like that, definitely brings new blood to the case and new eyes, and I think that's important. And as far as Stacy, your involvement.
Yeah, so like Christy, I began reporting in the suburbs, and there have been so many twists and turns in this case, and so many either false starts or reboots, that if you are a reporter in the Chicago area, this story has crossed your desk at some point. And I'm like Christy, I'm no exception to that. In 2012, they reached out to the Unabomber for DNA, right? And it was another way people got sucked in, and they raided a suspect's home in 2009, and so it just has been a constant. Every couple of years, something pops up.
It is definitely one of those cases where when you see a name like Ted Kaczynski pop up in there, it's the Unabomber connection is interesting. I believe, obviously, that DNA did not match, but it is still an interesting aspect and kind of shows a little bit of thinking outside the box, I guess, and maybe a little bit of a sign of desperation too.
Yeah, well, it's more of a defensive move by investigators, because their theory was, hey, we have a suspect in this case, and if we charge him, we want to block any defense attorney from saying, did you look at the Unabomber? You got a known domestic terrorist right in your backyard. Did you look at him? And hopefully this is, for them, this is their chance to say, yes, we did look at him. We did hear a very funny story. They did not actually officially get his DNA. He fought it. And then one day, randomly in the mail, Ted Kaczynski, someone purporting to send Ted Kaczynski's email or DNA from a laboratory showed up. And they have every reason to believe it is his DNA. And they did test it, but they do not have an official sort of chain of custody of his DNA, which, if it came down to it, I think they could fight, but they...
Yeah, Ted isn't one of those people that's really going to give up on that. I think he's going to fight that one to the tooth and nail, just from his musings, I guess we'll call them.
But he had an interesting connection, right, to the Chicago area, because he grew up here, and he actually, allegedly, one of his typewriters was bought in DuPage County, not far from where one of the victims died. So there, like Stacy said, it was definitely a defensive move to rule him out. But given those similarities and that he had to the area, they had to do it, right? And when they sought his DNA, it was, I had just started at the Chicago Tribune. I got hired at the Tribune in October of 2010, and the story broke not too long after that. And my job was to knock on the door of some of the victims' surviving family members. And I'll just never forget that assignment. It was shortly before 3 of the victims were connected by family: Stanley and Adam Janis, and Stanley's new bride, Terry. And I had to get reaction from Stanley and Adam's mother, and she died shortly thereafter. And I just remember she spoke Polish and some English, and I just remember interviewing her and the heartbreak in her voice, and pretty much lost hope, and had been living with this for so many years, having lost 2 of her sons. So, and that one stays with me.
As a true crime podcaster, we all kind of take a little bit of flack for sometimes dramatizing things or making things not so much about the victims. And I try my best to focus on the victims. And as a reporter, what is your approach and this goes to both of you, when you do speak with a victim's family, because I've done it and it's very difficult, and just was wondering what your guys' secret sauce was.
We like to say that, Christy and I will hound police departments and we'll hound prosecutors and we'll hound government agencies, but we don't hound victims. And in this case, we had multiple victims, and every single one of them was at a different point in their lives, in their grieving process, in their trauma. And so you had 7 very different ways of having to handle the families. And our decision very early on was that we were going to meet them where they were at. If they just wanted to talk off the record, we would listen. If they wanted to record and have, in the instance of Joe Janis, who lost 2 of his brothers and his sister-in-law, if he wanted to have his daughter next to him the entire time, well, then by all means. So we let them have some control over what was going to make them most comfortable and what they thought would do the most good for both the case and their loved one's memory.
That's very respectful. What about you, Christy?
I agree with what Stacy said, and Bill, we do feel your show honors victims, and that's why we're so proud to be here with you. I feel that in this case, you approach everybody, every story's different, and you think 40 years, time heals all wounds. They say no. We found out very quickly that the pain that these folks suffer, their loss, is as raw as if it happened yesterday. So, our approach is do no harm and leave people better than how you found them. And I think about how I'd want to be treated if it was my mother or my sister. So we approached people first with letters. We thought, I always think a handwritten letter, and Stacy does as well, is the most humane way to approach somebody in this situation rather than just a cold call. And there were some, such as the parents of 12-year-old Mary Kellerman, who lost their only child, who haven't spoken in decades to the media, and had moved out of state and really had been bruised and battered by the media and just how much attention this got, all over the years. So they really wanted nothing to do with the 40th anniversary media coverage, and we respected them. And in those situations, we sought out best friends and co-workers. And we were upfront, for example, with the Kellermans, that we had reached a childhood, a 6th grade teacher and a childhood best friend. And, I don't know that we got their blessings, but they said they wouldn't stand in our way. And we tried to keep them abreast of every development and let them know that we truly were just trying to show that a life was stolen here and it still matters. And I hope that we were successful in our mission of honoring the victims without traumatizing their family and friends in our coverage.
Well, I think that's very important to hear, and for everybody that's out there that, thinks that we don't take this stuff seriously, it's, it's not true. It's, we try to handle things with kid gloves and make sure that, at least in my situation where I've talked to victims, family members, it's, let them say what they need to say and don't be a voice for them. Let them talk and let them say their piece, because when it boils down to it, nobody knows what they're going through other than them. And it's so hard I can't fathom because I haven't been there, but I just trying to explain the way that you feel on the inside to somebody is hard enough. I can't imagine explaining to somebody what it was like to lose a family member or a sibling. And that would just be extremely challenging. I know that I've spoken with Libby German from Delphi, and her sister was killed 5+ years ago, and they're still looking for her killer. And it's it's just tragic. And with you guys being in a major city, murders happen, unfortunately, a lot in Chicago, and that is nothing to say one way or the other. It's a major metropolitan city. But when you get a case like this and you kind of get the chance to look back on something, this had to have been a pretty interesting assignment. I mean, was this something that you brought to your editor and said, we would like to do this, or was this something brought to you?
It was something brought to us because our editors knew that we had experience in the communities where these deaths occurred, that we had dabbled on and off in covering the case, and that this is sort of our background, dealing with police and prosecutors and grieving families. So it's sort of, and plus we're good friends, right? So if you're going to spend, 10 months in the trenches with somebody nonstop, it better be someone you can get along with, or it can get difficult real quick, right?
Oh, yeah.
And we had just came off covering the Kyle Rittenhouse trial in Kenosha, which was just a media frenzy. And I think we both really were looking for something different and something that appealed to me, and I know it did Stacy, this was a story that they were going to give us time and resources. So we traveled to 7 states. We interviewed more than 150 people. We were able, through FOIA, public records requests, which sometimes aren't cheap, to obtain tens of thousands of pages of documents. And that was, as a reporter, we all know that's great to get time to really give the story like this the time and resources it deserves.
It's pretty much the exact reason why I believe that podcasting is a great way to tell a story like this, because it really does give you a really large landing strip as far as being able to go tell the story piece by piece, really hit the streets, talk to people, knock on doors. What was the most interesting thing when you got started that was a challenge to you?
I think for me, one of the challenges was trying to find all these people who were involved in the case 40 years ago, trying to find them today. I used to joke to Christy, we have this impossible task of trying to find an Irish cop from Chicago 40 years ago. That's no easy task. We found them all in Florida. Don't worry. We found all of them. But I think that really, Christy will probably have a different answer than me. For me, that was one of the hardest parts of the detective. It was the most fun, right? Digging into obituaries to try to figure out where people are and who their family members are, and do we have the right person, and going through Facebook pages trying to figure out. So I think that was one of the most challenging, but also one of the most fun. It was a little bit like a scavenger hunt, actually.
Bill, we didn't know when we started that this was an active police investigation. We thought we were just getting, close to a year to work on a cold case for the 40th anniversary.
Surprise. Yeah.
Surprise.
Nice surprise.
I think it was the second or third week, perhaps, that I had reached an old retired Elmhurst detective, who Elmhurst is one of the suburbs outside of Chicago where one of the victims lived. And I had reached out to him. We were really at that point just trying to get, detectives sometimes take files when they retire, because for that book they're going to write, or maybe to continue working on this case as a private citizen. But so we were really at this point just trying to gather old documents. And I reached out to this detective who really was involved just a very short time on the task force. And he said, his name was Herb Hogberg. And he said, oh, my son, Herb Jr., is an FBI agent. He's doing some work on the case. And nearly fell off my chair and texted Stacy right away. And she worked the phones, and we continued, and we confirmed that there was an active investigation. So that was exciting. And early on, we were able to get a list of one of the first meetings of the task force that listed every name. And the task force that investigated Tylenol worked in teams of state police, FBI, and suburban cops. So we became obsessed, like Stacy said, there was over 100 names, trying to find these people and trying to find a woman, because it was very difficult to find a female. I think there were maybe 3 in the entire task force, a female FBI agent at the time, or state police investigator. So yeah, it was like needle in a haystack many times. But Stacy and I both are we love a good mystery, and we became obsessed with little details like finding photographs that of a victim that had never been found before, and things like that.
That's so cool, because that sounds exactly like what I would have wanted to go to college for. Instead, I went to college for blurbs and listicles and fun, great things like that nowadays. That
this
sounds like some
assignment.
I was going to say, this must have been an absolute dream for an investigative reporter, and then being financed by the Tribune to be able to do it. It's also incredible.
It's Stacy and I work she's a morning person, and when I say morning, we're talking like 5 a.m, gets up and runs, and I am a night owl. I was a bartender and a waitress through college, so we kind of worked this almost 24/7 for 10 months, and I'm not exaggerating.
That's pretty wild. And did you have along the way, did you get any like extra special access to anything that may not have been shown to previous reporters?
Yeah. Really, everything they've done since 2009 had never been shown to previous reporters. And we got our hands on an FBI presentation that they gave to prosecutors. And they told prosecutors, we have a chargeable circumstantial case, and here's our best evidence in the case. And we got one source to show it, and once one source showed it to us, another source showed it to us. So we got to kind of check ourselves that way too, right? So you don't have wrong information. So yeah, that's
when one person tells you the same thing that the other person told you, you're like, gold.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty impressive that you were able to get access to that information, especially with the names. Were these suspect names, or were these just people that had been interviewed along the way?
So what we found out was in 2012, there was so the Task Force 1 had investigated this in 1982, and it remained unsolved all these years. And in 2006, as the 25th anniversary approached, there was a reboot, Task Force 2, and they have focused on one main suspect this whole time, and that is James Lewis. And he is a former Missouri man who lived in Chicago under aliases because there was warrants out for his arrest in Kansas City for fraud. So he lived in Chicago for a very short time, he and his wife, and then 3 months before the Tylenol murders moved to New York. And he sent an extortion letter to Johnson & Johnson days after the murders, and his attorney admitted this when he went on trial for attempted extortion, that he was the letter writer, saying, if you want to stop the killing, wire $1 million to this bank account. And so he was never charged with the murders, but he was charged and convicted of attempted extortion and went to prison. So he is a man who has remained really the only suspect for the task force for the FBI all these decades. And he has played a catch-me-if-you-can cat and mouse game with law enforcement for years, and thus really is the person that the task force, the investigators, presented this case to in 2012. We saw this 50-page PowerPoint presentation. We saw undercover FBI video, which is really, I think, the closest thing to a smoking gun they have on Mr. Lewis. But prosecutors did not charge, did not make any movement in 2012. And there's been recent efforts with this 40th anniversary by investigators to continue to try to convince prosecutors that they have a case that is circumstantial but chargeable and solid against James Lewis.
I've done some research on this case as well, and James Lewis definitely is a character and definitely number one on my list too. I mean, didn't he send diagrams from prison saying if this was what was going to happen, this is how it would be done?
More than that, he called the FBI while awaiting his sentencing in the attempted extortion, and he offered to help solve the Tylenol murders. And that included drawing these very detailed diagrams. And if you go to ChicagoTribune.com, we have all of them up there. We got them from the National Archives. You can take a look for yourself and decide, is this someone who knew what he was talking about or took a really good wild guess?
He's a great artist. And while he was, like Stacy said, while he was awaiting sentencing, he's, contacted an FBI agent and said, I'm not the killer, but I can help you figure out who the killer is. And thus began in 1983, like a half dozen meetings between him and an assistant U.S. attorney and a state police investigator, in which he drew these, about 7 different drawings, which we reported a poison expert has determined are feasible for the poisonings. And there was a series of interviews. And in the interviews, he said just bizarre things. Like there was one thing that stuck with Stacy and I where the FBI agent, Roy Lane, had asked James Lewis, why do you think the killer chose extra strength Tylenol? Do you think maybe it was to spare a child from being a random victim? And according to Lane, Lewis broke out laughing hysterically and said, no, don't you get it? There's something extra in the Tylenol. Extra being the poison. So is that something that an innocent person would say? Perhaps, if they're playing this game with law enforcement, if they're enjoying this dance. But that is one of several pieces of this puzzle that has kept law enforcement on James Lewis's trail all these years.
He doesn't seem like the person that wants to give up playing this game. He's not one of those people that ran away and said, I'm not involved, don't bother me. He continues to put himself in there. And we all know, anybody who knows true crime, suspects and, perpetrators love to be involved with the investigation and know where the investigation's going. And, I don't know if it's a hero complex or what, but it's interesting because, why would you continue to do that if you had no reason to? I don't know.
It's really a defense attorney's biggest nightmare, right? That you have this client that keeps talking, and we know that he's spoken with authorities as recently as last month. The Illinois investigators flew to Boston, and he spoke with them for hours without an attorney present. So. I don't think we ever found an instance, maybe a couple, where he didn't talk, Chris, where he had the opportunity and declined to speak.
Tell him about the sting. You tell it better than me. In the video.
Yeah, the sting video.
The sting video. I don't know how much we should give away.
Be as coy as you want to be.
Just the sting itself, because it was his willingness to want to dance that got him.
Yeah, so the sting itself, in 2006, try to condense this, a Chicago journalist came to the FBI, not Christy or I, and he said, I think I figured out who the killer is, and it's not James Lewis, and it's not Roger Arnold, who was another primary suspect in the case, and he said it's someone completely different. So the FBI special agent in charge of the Chicago office was like, I'm very interested in hearing this. And he called up Roy Lane Jr., who is a retired FBI agent, very sort of a legendary FBI agent in the Chicago area, and for his renown of corruption. And Roy comes in and Lane listens to this pitch, and the journalist leaves, and the special agent in charge says, well, what do you think, Roy? And he says, it's a good story, but I don't think we know who it is. According to Roy, we just haven't arrested him. And they come up with this plan to re-engage with Lewis. And what they do is they have Roy reach out to Jim Lewis and say, hey, I'm working with a journalist. And this journalist says they figure out who the killer is. It's not you. Would you be willing to help her solve the crime, solve it and for her book? And of course, Jim Lewis agrees. And he starts working with this journalist who's not the journalist who originally brought the idea to the FBI. It's an undercover agent who's going by the name of Sherry Nichols. And as Roy is just chatting up and questioning Lewis and locking him into statements, Sherry's recording the whole thing. And this is the sort of sting operation they used against him in 2006 that led to them raiding his home in 2009, and ultimately led to the FBI saying, we have a chargeable circumstantial case.
So that leads me to believe that they think that he obviously is the guy that did it, but doesn't that also bring up the conundrum of the timing of his moving to Chicago, or moving from Chicago, and then the placement of the cyanide? And from what I had seen is that the cyanide would have eaten through the capsules within a certain amount of time. Is that still a belief, or has that been changed over time?
Therein lies the problem for investigators who are trying to convince prosecutors to charge James Lewis with the poisonings. They cannot prove that he was in Chicago during this basically 72-hour window that they think that the pills were salted with the cyanide. So you've got to remember, part of it is remember what the world was like in 1982. There was some identity theft, but it was a more innocent time. You could, if you paid cash, you could get on a train or a bus and even a plane without a driver's license. So it was much easier to get around, and without, if you wanted to be unnoticed. So what the task force did at the time in 1982 was they searched, after Lewis's name was revealed from the extortion letter, they searched, they looked high and low, records of rental cars and bus companies and trains and planes, airlines, and they have never been able to place James Lewis back in Chicago during the pivotal time that they believe that the pills were tainted. So, they one of the things they point to is Lewis didn't just send an extortion letter to Johnson & Johnson. He also sent somewhat of an extortion letter to the White House, Ronald Reagan, in 1982, and said, if you raise taxes, have you heard about those poisonings in Chicago? There's going to be more of them, something along those lines. And he cited how he had access, he owned a travel agency, which wasn't true, but that he had access to tickets and could fly all around the country undetected. So they have cited that letter that he penned as part of their evidence as to try to get around the fact that they can't place them in Chicago.
Wow. Yeah, that would be a issue. But the thing is, it's just insane that you can get on a plane, pay cash, and fly, to and fro without anybody knowing that. I guess back then it just would have been, he wasn't in Chicago very long, like you mentioned before. So it's not like he showed up and everybody be like, "Oh, hey, Jimmy, Lewis, you're welcome back." Hey, like even if he was there for 24 hours, I mean, he could have easily done that inconspicuously. And the fact that you can just travel around the country just paying cash at hotels and getting in a car and paying cash at gas stations. I mean, there are a myriad of ways that he could have facilitated this. Do they have anybody that says he was here on this day in Boston?
New York.
New York. Okay, I'm sorry.
He's in Boston.
To New York.
Now.
He's in Boston now.
Yeah.
Okay, I apologize.
After he served his sentence for the attempted extortion, he joined his wife in Boston, right? No, they don't have anyone who can place him in Chicago at the time. They have, I think the best they have is a former co-worker of his wife's and someone else in New York who recalls seeing him with a backpack, maybe near a train station. So not exactly conclusive evidence, but that therein lies the reason why the main hurdle that they've had all these years. And there is a second main suspect that we explored in our podcast as well, a man named Roger Arnold.
Right. His connection isn't as crazy. He's not as I'm out wanting to help you guys solve this case type of thing. He's probably more of the I don't know.
He did not keep interjecting himself.
Yeah, that's what I'm getting at.
Once he realized how deep he was in and how serious the investigation was into him, he did what most people do, and that is he got himself a lawyer and he shut up.
American way.
It is the American way, and it turned out to be the smart thing for him to do. Roger Arnold was a suspect in the case. Chicago police had jurisdiction over one of the homicides of the 7, and they sort of bifurcated themselves very, very early on from the main task force, and they kind of had their own little task force going, and they got a tip from a local bartender about a patron who had been acting erratic and talked about possessing cyanide. So he then was taken in, questioned, they searched his home. They found beakers and a handbook, a 007 License to Kill kind of handbook. Poor Man's James Bond, I think it was called. And it had a recipe in there on how to make potassium cyanide. And he had some weapons. So they jammed him up on weapons charges, and which were misdemeanors. And they let him go. And he had lawyered up. So really, they didn't dig too much further into him. But the damage from Roger Arnold's perspective had been done. His name had been national news. He said that he had trouble working. His coworkers no longer liked him, things like that. And he said teenagers threw garbage at his house. And so several months later, in June of 1983, he decides he's had enough of this. He's at a bar in Chicago, and he's told, "Hey, Marty Sinclair, the bartender who dropped a dime on you to police, he's here." So Arnold leaves the bar for a little bit, comes back. He says he's carrying a gun for his own protection. But it turns out that he approaches the man he believes is Marty Sinclair. He yells, "Marty, did you turn me in?" And then he fires a shot and fatally kills the man. But that man was not Marty Sinclair. That man was John Stanishaw, a computer programmer with 3 daughters and
Innocent.
a bright future. And it was a case of mistaken identity. And Christy has often referred to John Stanishaw as the 8th victim of the Tylenol killings, and I think that's absolutely true. It's just such a heartbreaking story.
I would agree with that statement. I mean, awful. Just awful.
We interviewed John Stanishaw's youngest daughter, Lori Edling. She's on the podcast. And one of the interesting parts of this reporting journey for Stacy and I was that many times we were able to connect people through our interviewing and help them find answers for themselves. For example, two old police detectives who had been partners years ago, decades ago, who had lost touch were now reconnected because we were interviewing them. And in Lori's case, she always wondered about the man that was the intended target. The man's name was Marty Sinclair. He was the bar owner who dropped a dime on Roger Arnold. And she was just like a 16-year-old girl when her dad was fatally shot. And she, Catholic family, Chicago Catholic family. And she recalls sitting in the pew of her father's funeral. And her father was heavyset, and Mr. Sinclair was heavyset, and they were bearded, both bearded men, and they looked a lot alike. And Lori recalls looking up and seeing a man at the end of the communion line to get mass, and she remembers just being startled at how much he looked like her father. And she tells the story, and Stacy and I both got shivers, and we were like, wow, this man came, the emotions he must have felt, that bullet was meant for him, and instead it killed a man who had 3 little daughters. And he came to the services, and Lori always wanted him to know that her family didn't blame him, that her father would have done the same thing. He would have called police too. There were 7 dead people from this horrible poisoning. The nation was terrified. A little girl died, and her father would have absolutely called and given police the same tip. So she wanted him to know that, but she'd never met him. The two families had, never met. And we reached out to Mr. Sinclair, who's elderly and in poor health. But through his son, we were able to share Lori's, Lori wanted them to have her number and to let them know that the family never blamed him. And this had weighed on her father's heart all these years. And it meant a lot to both of them to connect them. We have several of those kind of stories that just really was very gratifying for us both.
Yeah, and that being said, we've been talking for almost 40 minutes, and we really haven't gone over the actual 24 to 72 hours of terror that this really basically paralyzed the city, because it was pretty quick. Could you guys give me a little breakdown? Because, I know everybody knows the story, but it is always important just to circle back and just to get an idea of who the victims were and how many people from one particular family were actually impacted.
Sure. So the story begins at 6:15 a.m. on September 29th when 12-year-old Mary Kellerman wakes up and tells her parents she's not feeling well. Her dad tells her she can stay home from school. He goes downstairs to call the bus to say she's not going to be on it. And he hears a thump in the bathroom. And he goes up and opens the door, finds his daughter lying on the ground. Her breathing is shallow and her eyes are fixed and dilated. It's like she's being suffocated by some kind of invisible force. He calls the ambulance. They take her to the hospital. They put in a pacemaker and try to get her stable again. They can't, and she dies before 10 a.m. that morning. She's pronounced dead, and they assume it's a heart attack, which is very rare for a child, and it didn't make sense. But as the community is making sense of that, 8 miles away in Arlington Heights, Christy can kind of take it from there.
So later that afternoon, same day, a man named Adam Janis, he was 27 years old, and he lived in Arlington Heights with his 2 little kids, a boy and a girl, and his wife, Teresa, and he was a postal supervisor. He had the day off. He had been dealing with some aches and pains, but he was feeling a little better that day. So his wife described him being so happy that day. He was just in a really good mood and playing with their son in the kitchen. And then they ran some errands. He picked up his preschool-aged daughter from her Catholic school, and they went to the grocery store. He picked up some fresh cut lilies for his wife and a bottle of Tylenol, and came home and took the Tylenol and said he came out of the bathroom clutching his chest and basically collapsed. And his wife, in shock, saw some neighbors outside. One of them is a nurse and ran out for help. And Adam was taken to a nearby hospital and pronounced dead. He had the same symptoms that little Mary Kellerman had with the dilated, fixed eyes. And there was really not much they could do for him. And the doctor was a well-regarded renowned doctor named Thomas Kim at the hospital who had worked on Adam Janus, and he had the unfortunate task of telling Adam's family, that he had died. And it was a Polish family, Polish immigrant family, and he did most of his communicating, Dr. Kim, with Adam's younger brother, Stanley, who was 25. Stanley had just gotten married to his 20-year-old bride, Terry, months earlier that summer, and had just gotten back from their honeymoon in Hawaii. So obviously the family is very distraught, and they go back to Adam's home to comfort his widow, and also to make arrangements, funeral arrangements, and figure out the insurance, and perhaps headaches born from the day's grief. Take some time. Stanley took some Tylenol, and Terry took some Tylenol as well, and both suffered the same end that Adam had hours earlier.
They called the paramedics back to the Janus house for the second time that day. And it's the same crew. And there's a fire lieutenant who's in charge of the station that gets the call. And he says, second time in one day, we're all going. Firefighters, paramedics, the whole company's headed over there. So they get there, and when the lieutenant walks in, his paramedic looks up, is treating Stanley, and looks up at him and says, Lieutenant, it's the same thing that happened this morning, and we lost the guy this morning. And at this point, Teresa Janus is still upright. She's watching the paramedics treat her husband. She's calling out his name over and over again, and she's holding on to Fire Lieutenant Chuck Kramer. And then she collapses to the floor. He assumes she's fainted. He turns to roll her over and instantly sees that her eyes are fixed and dilated, which to any firefighter paramedic is the sign of death. And he turns to his company and says, guys, we're not dealing with heart attacks here. But he doesn't know what they're dealing with, right? He thinks it could be environmental. He thinks there could be some kind of virus floating around the house, killing everybody. So he takes everybody. They put Stanley and Teresa into the ambulances, and he takes the rest of the family who's there, and the first responders, and he says, we're all going to the hospital. We're all going to be quarantined because I don't know what's going on here. So they all get to the hospital, and they're working on Stanley and Terry, but everybody else is quarantined. Chuck Kramer doesn't know who's going to die next. Joe Janus said he was looking at his family thinking, who's going to die next? And they're all so confused as to what's going on. And Chuck calls his friend, Helen Jensen, who's the public health nurse in Arlington Heights. And Helen's at home, and she's making dinner, and he says, Helen, I need you here. And Helen rushes right over, walks into that room, and sees Adam's widow, who's also named Teresa, standing by herself in a corner. And she says, I want to talk to her. She goes and talks to her through the help of a family member translating. Teresa Janus walks Helen through the day. And the only thing connecting all three people in the family is this bottle of Tylenol. So Helen tells the cops, I want to go to that house. She gets the key from Teresa Janis. She goes to the house. She finds the bottle of Tylenol. It's a 50-count bottle. She pours it out on the table, counts. There's 44 capsules. So she does the quick math. 6 capsules are not there. 3 people taking the prescribed, 2-capsule dose. She decides it has to be the Tylenol. So she brings it back to the hospital.
And they don't believe her. She presents it to a medical examiner, an assistant medical examiner from Cook County who's there, and he just kind of blows her off. And she said she stamped her foot. She's sitting there in her summer it's fall, but it was a warm day, summer t-shirt and shorts, and said that she was just basically dismissed. So she went home and poured herself a glass of scotch and cried to her husband because she was certain that it was the Tylenol. Meanwhile, Dr. Kim is trying to figure out what has happened. So now he's got 3 young people who were healthy, 20, 25, and 27, when they woke up that morning. 2 are now deceased, and one is Terry, who was kept alive on life support, but she really, there wasn't much hope for survival. And he's trying to figure out what's going on. So he's calling poison centers around the country. He's pulling out his old medical books, pacing back and forth. They had ruled out that it was some sort of an environmental problem by this point, and they were really focusing on poisons. And Dr. Kim, at that time,
How many hours was this from the time of the first victim that they started to piece this thing together? Like when he's going through the books right now, when he's like trying to figure out what this poison could be. How many hours went by?
It's around 9 to 10 o'clock at night at this point. And so, Mary Kellerman, the call to her house was at 6:15 a.m. So,
Under 24 hours.
Every minute counts.
Wow.
Oh, yeah.
And
there were a few things that came together. For example, it wasn't common for doctors to order screenings for potassium cyanide at the time, but Dr. Kim had their blood tested at a lab without he's put it sent it in a cab to have it tested in the wee hours of the night. And then also, Stacy had told you about a fireman named Chuck Kramer, and he had a conversation with a firefighter friend of his from a neighboring town, and they put together the situation with Mary Kellerman and the Janices. And so the Kellerman bottle of Tylenol was brought to the hospital, and that ended up being tested at the Cook County Medical Examiner's Office. So over the course of, I think Dr. Kim got his results back by 1 a.m., and then the Cook County Medical Examiner's Office tested the tainted pills from the 2 bottles, and they got the results that evening. So by the morning, there was a press conference. When was it, Stacy? 9 a.m.?
The press conference was at 9 a.m., but a reporter named John Flynn Rooney broke the story in Chicago at 5:30 in the morning. And so less than 24 hours after Mary Kellerman takes her first Tylenol, kicking off this just tragic series of events, the medical and first responder communities have solved the medical mystery. They know that the Tylenol is poisoned, and they get the word out there, and there is no doubt that these people saved lives.
Thank you so much to Christy and Stacy of the Chicago Tribune for joining me this week on Who Killed to discuss the Chicago Tylenol Murders and their podcast, Unsealed. You can find their podcast wherever you get your favorite shows, as well as Who Killed, where I drop new episodes every Friday. And again, if you guys are interested in checking out their stuff on the Tribune, they do provide the link. It is Chicago Tribune /Tylenol Murders, and that is of course, chicagotribune.com/Tylenol Murders. And if you guys would like to support the show, you could do so by the Venmo app using my username with @Bill-Huffman-3. And again, every contribution does help keep this show on the air. So I appreciate everything and everything that you guys do as far as listening and supporting the show. Part 2 of this great conversation with these incredible investigative reporters will air next Friday, and we will wrap up our conversation about the unsolved Chicago Tylenol murder case. So, if you have any information, please feel free to reach out to the Chicago FBI or just call 1-800-CALL-FBI. Again, as always, until next week, stay healthy and be safe.
You might be surprised to know that not all serial killers are straight cisgender white men, and the victims of true crime are not a monolith either. She's Wendy and I'm Beth, and together we host Fruit Loop's Serial Killers of Color, a true crime podcast.
Together we take deep dives into the true crime stories about marginalized and minoritized perps and victims that often go untold.
We also provide the context and nuance that these stories deserve. At Fruit Loops, we're serving up true crime with a side of history, society, culture, and some fun.
Listen to Fruit Loop Serial Killers of Color on Spotify, Google Play, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Women's Running Stories, where we explore the intersection between running and life. Because every woman who is committed to a running journey has a story to tell, and this is where you'll find those stories. I am host and producer Cherie Louise Turner. I'm a 53-year-old runner, and together with original music by musician and runner Cormac O'Regan, we bring these inspirational stories to life. Please join us to fuel your adventures.